Now, I think it's worth asking the question then, how have the CSIRO developed BARLEYmax?
Well, I think one would say, with all honesty, it is a meeting of minds. We knew for a long time that we needed to increase the supply of resistant starch in the diet. Our colleagues at Plant Industry were using barley as a model system for working on wheat because it's a simpler grain. We got together and we discussed the possibilities, and we identified what is now known as BARLEYmax as the candidate. And it's actually turned out to match and exceed many of our expectations.
Purist nutritionists might argue that why do we have a need to develop a new grain? Why are we not just eating, the sort of hunter-gatherer approach of foods that are available to us?
Well, that's because we consume processed foods. Nobody, goes out and hunts and gathers, except at the supermarket. And,
which doesn't take too much energy.
That's right, unless you're trying to control the basket.
Yes.
Or the trolley.
And two young children along with it.
But the simple answer is, we eat processed foods. Now, those processed foods supply us with nutrients, they supply us with fibre, they supply us with vitamins and minerals. Unfortunately, the processing comes at a cost. And the cost is that the resistant starch that is consumed in many traditional societies has disappeared. We have tried to manipulate processing, but it doesn't work too well. So you need ingredients like the high maize, for example, that's in the marketplace. Yeah. There are sources of resistant starch in the food supply, but they're relatively limited. So BARLEYmax is necessary to use current processing systems to produce foods that are higher in fibre and resistant starch.
So does the processing of BARLEYmax, when it will then be used in our food supply, is that going to affect the nutritional properties?
It's not going to alter the fibre, it's not going to alter the other nutrients, but resistant starch is affected by cooking. And what we in the CSIRO do is we measure the levels of resistant starch in processed foods.
Now, in a global first for any government health authority, the recommendations of Australia's National Health and Medical Research Council specify a resistant starch component in their fibre intake advice. Now, this is pretty leading edge. Are we leading the world in this area?
Well, it's very easy to sound boastful and it's very easy to undersell. But the achievement here is an achievement for Australian science, not just the CSIRO. The definition of dietary fibre, what is permitted to be labelled as dietary fibre, we were, I think, the first to, in fact, I'm pretty sure, we were the first to recognise resistant starch as a contributor to fibre. And I think we also are the first to mandate an intake of resistant starch. But I do emphasise that this is an achievement for Australian science, not just the CSIRO.
So when we read currently, I know there's a number of different methods of measuring fibre in foods. When we read currently the grams of fibre that's on the side of the packet of foods that we buy, does that currently include resistant starch, or do we have any way of knowing? Not
currently, no. The current method for what's called total dietary fibre does incorporate a fraction of resistant starch, but it varies by food type. So it's not, at the moment, that easy for consumers to tell. They have to look for backup information. We are developing a method, in collaboration with others, a method to measure resistant starch specifically. There are methods out there, but the problem is it's a rather difficult quantity to measure. So the consumer can get confidence that there is fibre there and that it includes resistant starch. Until we mandate a specific method, it's going to be through reading backup information.
Now, as a consumer, the fibre intakes recommendations have actually changed over the years, and they vary from country to country. In your view, how much fibre is enough?
If I set a figure, people will say that's enough. But the evidence is that the lowering of the risk of serious disease, and I mean serious diseases, diseases that not only make you ill but also kill you, they show that increased consumption leads and proportionately leads to greater protection. The current Australian recommendation is about 30 grams per person per day. That does not at the moment include for the general consumer the resistant starch, which is on top of, and the general figure for that is 20 grams. So consuming foods which meet dietary guidelines and contain fibre and resistant starch is going to be good, and probably the more the better.
So we're getting more in lines with some of the estimates of what our ancestors' fibre intakes would have been. We're much higher, up to sort of, 80, 90 grams a day.
That's an interesting question. Not certain what people ate historically. What we do know is that they ate whole grains. The average consumption in Australia of fibre is close to 30 grams per person per day. The figure for resistant starch is laughable. It's about 4 to 6 grams per person per day. What has emerged is that populations that are at low risk of serious disease, such as colon cancer, do not necessarily eat a lot of fibre. They do eat a lot of resistant starch.
Now, would that be the Asian communities, for example? Would
it used to be the Asian communities because Asian countries are becoming like us. Japan, for instance, has gone from hero to zero. They used to have a very low rate of colon cancer. With westernisation, with affluence, they now have the highest rate in the world. By the way, we are second. The population we tend to compare ourselves to are the native Africans. They consume whole grain foods, but they also have high intakes of resistant starch. And we know that the biomarkers, the things that we can measure in them, particularly in their feces, stools, which we think mediate the protection, are high. These are the short-chain fatty acids.
So it's almost as if that original research in the African communities, which identified fibre as being so important for gut health, actually was wrongly identifying fibre as resistant starch.
With hindsight, and science has got perfect vision. It's not so good going forwards. But they were eating whole grains. They were eating vegetables, and they were eating, foods which, to all intents and purposes, were high in fibre. And with current knowledge, they were absolutely right to identify fibre as being important. It's the fact that we've learnt now that they were eating a different type of fibre, the resistant starch, as well.
What is the latest research saying in relation to fibre and bowel cancer?
Well, we have another development in Australia which is very promising from this point of view. Anti-Cancer Council is linking increased consumption of dietary fibre with lowered risk of colon cancer. That's very important. Colon cancer kills, I think, 4,500 people a year in this country. There are more people dying from colon cancer than die on the roads. What the latest research is showing is that fibre is protective. And the work that we're doing in the CSIRO, with our partner organisations like the Flinders Medical Centre, the Ludwig Institute, is showing very strongly it's indicating very strongly the potential of resistant starch and its fermentation products to certainly promote bowel health, in other words, promote the function of the gut, but also to offer some protection against colorectal cancer. We think that at least 50% of colorectal cancer is preventable.
Which is phenomenal.
Oh, it's pretty
big. It's a huge number of people.
Yes.
So we're talking more than 2,000 people could have been prevented from death from this disease.
We think so, yes, we think so. At the very worst, BARLEYmax products will be of benefit in terms of promoting bowel health. If our expectations are met, we hope that we will see a reduction in due course in the rates of colorectal cancer and possibly also of associated conditions like inflammatory bowel disease.
Yeah. Okay, now my own scientific research background was in glycemic index science. So are there any benefits here because of the fibre levels and resistant starch levels in BARLEYmax? Yes,
I should point out that much of the work that we've done, all of it that we've published in international scientific journals. Both ourselves in Food Futures and also other colleagues have done studies on BARLEYmax and glycemic index. And BARLEYmax has a lower glycemic index than standard barleys. It is a low glycemic index food. It also has the property of what's called the second meal effect. So as well as lowering the glycemic index of the meal you're having of BARLEYmax, it also assists in the control of glucose in the subsequent meal.
Can you tell us why that is? Is that to do with the fibre in the gut?
We think so. Working on some of these is rather difficult because, as you can understand, the gut is deep in the body. But what we think is happening is that the fermentation products are assisting the liver in the short term, the medium term, which is the second meal effect, and in the long term to control blood glucose through these fermentation products.
So eating BARLEYmax in the morning, therefore, is going to have a carryover effect to lunch and then even into the
Possibly,
afternoon.
yes.
Evening
Well,
meals.
certainly to lunch. The work so far is only to a breakfast of BARLEYmax and then a lunch containing other foods. But the evidence from people in the United States, a guy called Mike McBurney has done a lot of work in this space, suggests that it assists in long-term glucose control.
Fantastic.
But we haven't proved that ourselves.
Okay, so is BARLEYmax therefore going to be of benefit to people with diabetes?
Certainly, because people with diabetes have problems around the control of glucose. So they either make insufficient insulin or it doesn't work. So anything that poses less of a challenge to the pancreas and assists the insulin working will be of benefit. It also helps them because it provides dietary fibre. And, of course, people with problems of diabetes, the complications of diabetes come not just from the diabetes, but also because of the dietary issues. They have to eat foods that don't pose much of a challenge to the pancreas.